G'day and welcome to Disc Golf Down Under. It's Matt here. In this video, I'm going to get a little nerdy and talk about MVP's different plastics. And specifically, I'm going to ask the question, which plastic is the most overstable, which is the most understable, and can we rank the different plastics in order of stability, and can we predict how different plastics will behave? Well, let's get into it and do a deep dive on plastic stability. Okay, so if you've played disc golf for more than a few months, you should have heard about disc stability. If you haven't, don't worry, we'll do a quick crash course in the next section of the video. Okay, so as your disc collection grows, you'll be on the hunt for discs that might be more or less stable than a disc you already have. And one way you can attack this might be to look online and find a disc with a flight rating less stable than your current disc. But did you also know that the same disc mold in the same weight flies differently when made from a different plastic? Now, if you read online forums or Facebook groups, which is a dangerous thing to do, I'm sure you've seen a post that goes a little like this. I have a max weight Proton Insanity, but I want something less stable. Which plastic should I get? And this will be followed by dozens of responses with every available plastic and more. And of course, this will lead to the inevitable arguments and flame wars between different posters, and the original poster ends up more confused than when they first asked the question. So, I set out to do an experiment to see if I could make sense of it and determine if the MVP plastics could be ranked from most stable to least stable. And joining us in this experiment will be, in my opinion, the greatest driving putter ever made, the Axiom Envy. I've been throwing the Envy for around 4 years now in a variety of weights and plastics. And since the Envy is one of my favorite discs, I of course have a backup stash. So here I have 7 virgin Envies, never thrown before this test, all between 170 and 175 grams, and all manufactured within the last 2 years. So these 7 discs cover all of the MVP plastics except for the Cosmic mixes, recycled R2 and fission. I'll be talking a bit more about fission in a future video, and R2 was left out because it will likely see variation due to which plastics get mixed into the recycler. So before throwing any of them, I have 4 questions I want to answer in this video. So number 1, based purely on my experience, can I rank these 7 plastics from most stable to least stable? Number 2, does the user community online and fan base have any idea on ranking the plastic stability? Number 3, based on measurements of the discs, can I rank these 7 discs in order of most stable to least stable? And finally, number 4, is there a solid rule that we can use to say that any disc in plastic A is more stable than plastic B? But before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about stability and what makes one disc more stable than another disc. Okay, so here I have 2 drivers, same weight, same speed 11, same glide rating of 5, but different wing shape. So how will they fly? Okay, so let's start with this disc. It has the nose of the disc down near the bottom of the underside, and you can see that when it's thrown right-hand backhand, it turns to the right. This is what we call a very understable disc. This disc, on the other hand, has the nose high up on the disc near the top of the flight plate, and you can see that when it is thrown right-hand backhand, it turns to the left, and we call this a very overstable disc. So fundamentally, disc stability is driven by the wing shape, and you may have heard of something called the parting line height. Now, all disc golf discs are made by injection molding in a mold that splits in half at the middle. And at this parting line, they leave a small gap between the mold halves so that air can escape. And this also means a small amount of plastic can flow through this gap, and you end up with a flash line. So on most discs, you can actually see the parting line height, and you can measure it. Now, besides the disc profile, there are a number of other factors that affect how a disc flies, such as disc weight, the altitude that you're throwing at, air temperature, amount of wear on the disc, release speed, wind speed and direction, and heaps more. And this video would turn into a feature-length movie if I was to sit here and discuss all of these factors. But the one that most people seem to be interested in is the effect of different plastics. So you may now ask the question, why do 2 discs made from the same mold but different plastics fly with different stability? Well, it goes back to our injection molding process. Discs are made by injecting molten liquid plastic at high pressure into a metal mold and then cooling it down until the plastic freezes back into a solid. And if you remember back to your high school science classes, what happens to materials as they get colder? Well, they contract or shrink. But since a disc is not a uniform shape, the thicker rim will shrink differently to the thinner flight plate. And as a result, the profile of the disc changes as it cools down, it warps. Now, all discs of the same name are made in the same mold, so they start out with the same starting shape, but as they cool down, they change. And because different plastics are molded at different temperatures and have different expansion coefficients, different plastics result in a different profile once they cool to room temperature. So hopefully that explains simply why different plastics fly differently. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of disc stability, let's start with the first question on my list. Can I use my past experience of throwing different discs to rank my 7 envies from most stable to least stable? Now, I have to preface this by saying that most of my discs in different plastics are high-speed drivers, so will that knowledge transfer to a putter? Okay, so I only have a few discs in the MVP Eclipse plastic, but all of them have been way more overstable than any other plastic. So I'll start by putting the Eclipse Envy at number 1 on the most stable. Now, moving to the other end of the spectrum, you may have already noticed that the Envy in the baseline electron plastic has a flight rating which is 1 point more understable to begin with. So that has to be at the opposite end, at number 7. Next, we've got the mainstream premium plastics. So we've got neutron, plasma, and proton. And typically I've found that proton, neutron, and plasma is the decreasing order of stability. So let's pop them in the middle. So that leaves me with the soft neutron and the prism. Now, I already bag a soft neutron Envy, and it's one of my favorites. It's a very stable disc. So I'm going to slot that in, based on my experience, at number 2. And finally, the prism plastic is primarily plasma with a overmold, a neutron or a proton overmold. So I'm going to pop prism in between neutron and plasma. Okay, so there's my ranking from most stable to least stable. Let me know in the comments, how would you rate these 7 plastics from most to least stable? Have I got it right? Okay, so next I did what any naive and confused disc golfer does. Turn to the internet. I jumped on the official MVP Facebook group and I posted a question asking the community to rank my 7 Envy plastics in order from most stable to least stable. And I let it run for a couple of weeks, and over that period I had 20 people play the game. And as expected, not one single person agreed on the order. I received 20 uniquely different answers. So what to make of all this? How was I going to make sense of it? Well, I went through each individual answer and I gave 1 point to their most stable plastic through to 7 points for their least stable plastic. And then I tabulated all the data and averaged the scores, and this is what I ended up with. Now, one thing that the MVP community can agree on is that the electron plastic is the least stable plastic, with 100% of responses ranking it number 1. At the other end, 80% responses selected the Eclipse plastic as the most stable. So in between, we have, in order of decreasing stability, prism, proton, soft neutron, neutron, and plasma. Okay, so this was a little bit different to what I thought, but we'll see shortly how well the community went. Okay, I'm an engineer, so we must be able to solve this using science. We said earlier that stability is driven by the wing shape and ultimately the parting line height. So I should be able to measure the parting line height and then rank the discs using this value. The higher the flash line, the greater the stability, right? So I pulled out my digital calipers and measured each disc carefully multiple times and recorded the average parting line height around the disc for each of the discs. And this is what I came up with, from most to least stable based on parting line height. Okay, so that looks a little unusual and not what I was expecting. So enough with all these games, let's go out and throw these discs. For the flight test, I've tried to minimize all the variables so that plastic is the only variable that changes. As I mentioned before, these are all virgin Envies, never thrown before, manufactured within the last 2 years. I'm throwing at sea level with a basket directly in front of me at 80 meters, and I'm aiming to release each disc flat and parallel to the ground at the basket. There was a mild headwind during the test blowing from the left at a 45-degree angle, but this stayed fairly constant throughout, so that shouldn't affect the results too much. I threw each disc 10 times and I was trying to release each set of discs at the same speed, around 80% power level. And after all this, I reviewed all the videos and scored each throw a number between +3 through to -3, based on where each disc landed relative to where I released it. So if the disc moved, say, 3 meters to the right, I would give this 1 point. And if it went 10 meters to the left, I'd give it +3 points. And of course, there were a few dud throws where I threw nose up or wrong release angle, and I didn't score these throws. So around 20% of my throws were discarded. I then averaged the scores of all the good throws and was able to rank the 7 discs from most stable to least stable. So let's count them down, starting with the most overstable disc. Okay, so I was surprised straight out of the gate, and I was not expecting this result. The Prism was the most stable of the 7 discs in my collection, and by a decent margin also. It scored an average stability of +1.375 in my +3 to -3 system, and only 2 out of the 20 fans from the MVP community put the Prism at number 1. Okay, the fan favourite, and mine also for most stable plastic, coming in at the number 2 spot with an average stability of +0.875. The Eclipse Glow plastic contains a lot of fluorescent filler, which affects the shrinkage and generally results in a much more stable disc. Now the Prism Plasma was number 1, so it's not surprising to see the Plasma not far behind the Prism plastic with an average stability score of +0.5. This really goes against what I've found in other discs, where the Plasma is usually less stable than neutron and proton plastics. Okay, another surprise for me, the soft neutron coming in the middle of the pack with an average stability score of 0.125. As I mentioned at the start, I've had a soft neutron Envy since I started out throwing MVP, and I love this disc for its stability. So I was actually disappointed to see this brand new soft neutron was nowhere near as stable as the disc that I've been throwing for years. It's possible that this 5-year-old Envy was made in a different mold and maybe even a different plastic recipe compared with this modern soft neutron Envy. So for me, based on my testing, I expect the Prism Envy might be replacing my tired soft neutron Envy. Another unexpected result with the proton plastic falling into 5th place with an average stability score of 0, indicating a very straight flyer. Both myself and the community predicted the proton to be at the stable end, with 50% putting it in the top 3 for stability. But surprisingly, it's at the other end. No surprise to see Electron at the understable end, but it is a surprise that it's been beaten, but only just. Electron had an average stability score of -2.375, and I found this to be a very flippy disc straight from the first throw. Electron is a less durable plastic, so it will season in quickly and become even more flippy, so keep that in mind as well. And in our final position, the most understable disc, and a complete shock to me, Neutron, scoring an average of -2.5, so only just behind the Electron. This disc is a flip and glide demon with tons of turn, and I think it might find a slot in my bag also. Okay, so let's go back and look at my 4 questions and see if we can answer them. So number 1, based purely on my experience, can I rank these 7 plastics from most stable to least stable? Number 2, does the user community and fan base have any idea on ranking plastic stability? Number 3, based on measurements of the disc profile, can I rank these 7 discs in order of most stable to least stable? And finally, number 4, is there a solid rule that we can use to say that any disc in plastic A is more stable than plastic B? Okay, well, at the end of all this, I'm seriously standing here scratching my head. Even when I place the most overstable and the most understable discs side by side, I can't see anything to explain such a vivid difference in the flight path. So the bottom line is there's no hard and fast rule for a more stable or less stable plastic. Firstly, drivers are shaped differently to putters and they will shrink differently. And secondly, manufacturers change their plastic blends from batch to batch. And processes can change, molds can change shape, they gradually wear out over time. And finally, MVP uses an overmold on their discs, which combines two different plastics, and they do them in two different shots. And they will shrink at different rates, just to complicate things even more. To be honest, I wasn't expecting the video to end this way. I personally thought that I had a good feeling for the different plastics, and after hearing so many experts talk about putting line heights, I thought the scientific method would be a good predictor of stability. But no, it doesn't work. Well, at least for MVP's overmold discs anyway. It also explains why you see so much variation in online discussions with heated arguments where nobody can agree. Basically, if you want a more or less stable version of an existing disc, you'll just have to go out and buy a mix of discs and try them out. So if you need an excuse to go out and buy more discs, you can add trying different plastics to your list. Well, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching and see you next time.